Good afternoon and welcome to the analysis of Senate Bill 3, the minimum wage law in California, presented by Laura Belvin, Mariana Mitchell, and Stephanie Podine for Spring 2018 MPA 570 Policy Analysis for California Baptist University. Here we have a brief overview of today's presentation, which will include the identifying of the problem that led to the implementation of Senate Bill 3, a brief history and background of minimum wage, comparison of California minimum wage versus the federal minimum wage, legislative history of Senate Bill 3, the identification of key stakeholders affected by the legislation, the policy models that are exemplified in the process to create Senate Bill 3, an evaluation of outcomes since enactment, the Christian viewpoint of minimum wage mandates, policy alternatives compared to Senate Bill 3, next steps for the state of California now that Senate Bill 3 has been implemented, and lastly, our list of references. There were many factors that led to implementation of Senate Bill 3. California has historically led the charge on a number of labor-related items, such as sick leave for all and minimum wage, and a move to fight poverty and decrease the wage gap and wealth inequality that currently exist. The state of California focused on providing a living wage for all residents through the increase of minimum wage. At the time of introduction of Senate Bill 3 in 2015, minimum wage was $9 an hour, and with a higher cost of living and a booming economy, still it was not a wage one could support a family on. The debate over minimum wage has significant meaning to the United States in that it has always been used as a tool to ensure a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Initially implemented to protect women and children, which ended up being unconstitutional, it was of great importance in assisting the United States in coming out of the Great Depression when President Roosevelt mandated a minimum wage of 25 cents an hour as a part of the implementation of the Fair Labor and Standards Act in 1938. Minimum wage continued to rise and peaked in 1968, which when adjusted for inflation was equal to $10.90 in 2015 dollars. As you can see, when compared to the federal minimum wage, California has historically always paid a higher wage, and increases occurred more often than federal law mandated. This was usually because the cost of living was markedly higher in California as compared to the rest of the nation, while also having a higher level of poverty than the national average. This was an indicator that the wealth inequality in California was the cause of the public outcry of low-skilled entry-level laborers to fight for a living wage. In an attempt to keep up with inflation and close the wage gap, there were several bills that mandated minimum wage increases, such as Assembly Bill 1835 in 2008 and Assembly Bill 10 in 2014. However, these were only short-term fixes and did little for the battle against the continued increase in cost of living in California. Senate Bill 3 was initially introduced by State Senator Mark Leno, Democrat from San Mateo in San Francisco County, in December of 2014. The original bill, co-authored by State Senator Connie Leyva from Chino, had only sought two increases, one in 2016, raising minimum wage to $11 an hour, and another in 2017, raising minimum wage to $13 an hour. After being held in committee and further discussed, it was determined that the speed of the boost to minimum wage needed to increase to truly affect wage inequality, and the committee did not want to have to keep coming back regularly with a new bill. Thus, it was reborn as it has worked its way through the Senate and Assembly and various committees until it was finally approved and signed by Governor Jerry Brown on April 4th of 2016. As you can see, Senate Bill 3 morphed into a minimum wage mandate that would span across several years, ultimately ending up at $15 an hour in 2022 for employers with over 25 employees or more. Other items added to the bill was the ability for the state to postpone any increases in the event of an economic downturn, the linkage of minimum wage to the U.S. Consumer Price Index once it reached $15 an hour, and the addition of in-home support service workers to the minimum paid sick leave provision already in effect in California. It is important to understand all of the key stakeholders who are both involved and affected by the implementation of Senate Bill 3. Starting at the local level, there are the employees themselves, both those making minimum wage and those making more, the local unions who advocated for the increases that would result in increased revenues for them as well, shareholders and business owners who would have to adjust operations to account for the increased personnel costs, public agencies who are bound to personnel rules and regulations and negotiated memorandums of understanding that determine the compensation levels, and last but not least, the politicians themselves who seek to fill the needs of their constituents in order to ensure re-election. In reviewing all of the data, we were able to identify two specific policy models that were exemplified in the creation of Senate Bill 3. The first being the multiple streams model, with the problem being poverty and low wages, the policy to increase minimum wage as needed, and the politics that were in place that allowed for support to occur from both the Senate and Assembly as well as the public. Without all three streams acting in accordance, Senate Bill 3 might not have seen the light of day. Also identified was the use of incrementalism when authoring Senate Bill 3 through the use of small and gradual increases to minimum wage in order to allow for the necessary adjustments and ultimately acceptance of the pending increases to minimum wage. Senate Bill 3 was enacted in 2016, and California experienced the first of many minimum wage increases in 2017, raising minimum wage to $10.50 an hour, and more recently in 2018 to $11 an hour. In reviewing the effects and evaluating the outcomes of Senate Bill 3, a study conducted by UC Berkeley Institute for Research on Labor and Employment established a minimum wage model that clearly depicted the effects of minimum wage on both the workers and businesses, leading to a net effect on jobs. UC Berkeley determined that higher wages led to lower turnover rates, higher incomes, thus motivating the economy with higher consumer demand that would ultimately offset the increased cost of payroll, higher prices for price-sensitive industries, and potentially fewer jobs. Opinions remain divided on the effectiveness of minimum wage increases, as shown by the subsequent study released by the state of Washington that focused on Seattle's recent wage mandates and found that overall salaries fell for low-wage workers due to a decrease in hours and reduction of staffing. When it comes to the Christian point of view, you will find Christians on both sides of the minimum wage argument. Depending on how minimum wage personally affects an individual is likely to determine where they fall in their approval or disapproval of minimum wage mandates. As it is extremely difficult to essentially make everyone happy, one must rely upon working towards creating the most good in the world, and if we choose to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, we must care for those that are in need, as charity will never decrease wealth. Although Senate Bill 3 is already in motion, there is potential for reviewing policy alternatives once the state of California reaches the final increase of $15 an hour. One such alternative would be to adjust wages similar to the Federal Office of Personnel Management general schedule that relies upon grades and steps based on your level of education. Another would be the ability to pay wages based on locality that takes into consideration the cost of living of the area one is working in. Moving forward, Senate Bill 3 will continue to be studied and evaluated as we continue to move through the provisions for increases to come. It will be up to the business owners and organizations alike to seize the many opportunities brought by the changing work environment due to increased wages. From creating networks of support to share resources, to utilizing technology to revolutionize the service and food industries, it is up to us to determine how we will be able to use Senate Bill 3 to close the wage gap and fight wealth inequality. Despite the optimism of increased minimum wage, there still lies uncertainty in what the future may bring in the event of an economic downturn. Nevertheless, the future of California continues to look bright. Here is a complete list of the resources that were used in the research of Senate Bill 3 should you wish to further delve into the subject matter. This brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. We thank you for your time, and please feel free to provide any additional feedback.